The night the man came back was so quiet that even the hum of the old refrigerator in my kitchen sounded too loud. And I was standing by the sink with my hands in warm dishwater, when I heard a soft knock on the front door. And for some reason my heart started beating like it already knew something my mind had not caught up to yet. And I remember drying my hands on the same faded blue dish towel I had owned since my son was in middle school, and walking toward the door thinking it was probably Mrs. Henderson from next door asking if I had any sugar again because she was always baking something for her church group, and I opened the door without looking through the peephole. And there he was standing on my porch under the yellow porch light looking thinner, older, and more tired than the man I had once loved. And before I could say a word he whispered my name like he was afraid it might shatter if he said it out loud. And in that moment the past 20 years came rushing back like a storm I had tried so hard to forget. I stood there gripping the doorframe because my legs suddenly felt weak, and I could smell the familiar scent of his old leather jacket mixed with cold night air, and my mouth went dry as I tried to find my voice, and all I could manage was a shaky whisper asking him if he was real, and he nodded slowly, and said he was sorry, and that he knew he had no right to be here, but he did not know where else to go, and behind him the street was empty and quiet, the same street where our kids once rode there. Bikes and chalk drawings covered the sidewalk every summer. His name was Daniel, and he had disappeared when our son Luke was 12 and our daughter Emily was 9, and back then we lived in a small rented house on Maple Street in a quiet Ohio town where everyone knew everyone, and kids walked to school together, and Friday nights were for football games and pizza from Tony's Pizza Shop on Main Street. And Daniel worked at the local auto repair shop while I worked part-time at the grocery store bagging groceries and chatting with neighbors. And we were not rich, but we were happy in the simple way families are when they still believe love is enough. Daniel used to come home smelling like motor oil and sweat, and he would wash his hands at the kitchen sink while telling me stories about stubborn engines and funny customers, and then he would scoop Emily up in his arms and ruffle Luke's hair, and ask about their day, and sometimes we would sit on the couch after the kids went to bed watching old reruns, and talking about saving up for a bigger place someday. Then one day he did not come home. At first I thought he had been in an accident, and I called the repair shop and the hospital, and even the police station. And everyone told me they had not seen him. And I remember standing in the middle of the living room staring at the front door like it might open any second. And he would walk in laughing about some silly misunderstanding. But the hours turned into days and days into weeks, and Daniel never came back. The police filed a missing person report, and his co-workers said he had seemed quiet lately, but nothing unusual. And some neighbors whispered about him leaving me for another woman, and others said maybe he had gotten into trouble and run away. And I tried to stay strong for the kids, but at night I would cry into my pillow so they would not hear me. Luke started acting out at school and getting into fights, and Emily would cling to me and ask every night when her daddy was coming home, and I had no answers. And every time I saw a man with dark hair and broad shoulders at the grocery store my heart would jump thinking it might be him. Months passed and then years, and eventually people stopped asking about Daniel, and life forced me to move forward even though my heart felt like it had a permanent crack in it, and I took on more hours at work and learned how to fix leaky faucets and mow the lawn and fill out school forms alone. And there were nights I would sit at the kitchen table staring at his old coffee mug wondering how someone could just disappear like that. Luke grew up angry and quiet, and Emily grew up sensitive and cautious. And I tried my best to be both parents for them, but there were times when I felt like I was failing. And when Luke was 17 he shouted at me during an argument, and said his dad had left because of me, and that cut deeper than anything else because it was the same fear I had buried in my own heart. Now here Daniel was standing on my porch after 20 years looking like a ghost from another life, and my mind was racing with 1,000 questions and emotions, and I wanted to slam the door in his face, and also wanted to collapse into his arms at the same time, and instead I stepped aside and quietly told him to come in. He walked into the living room like he was afraid to touch anything, and he stared at the family photos on the wall, and his eyes filled with tears when he saw pictures of Luke in his high school football uniform, and Emily in her graduation cap and gown. And he whispered that they had grown up, and I told him yes, they had grown up without him, and my voice shook with anger and pain. He sat down on the edge of the couch, and said he did not expect forgiveness, and that he knew he had caused us pain, and that he had lived with that guilt every day, and then he took a deep breath and started telling me the truth. He said that back then he had gotten into serious trouble with some people he should never have been involved with, and that it started with a small loan he took to help his brother who was in deep financial trouble, and that loan turned into something darker and more dangerous, and when he could not pay it back they started threatening him, and eventually they threatened us and the kids, and he said he was terrified and did not know how to protect us, and he believed that the only way to keep us safe was to disappear so that they would stop looking for him. He said he left town in the middle of the night and changed his name and worked under the table jobs in different states and lived a lonely, quiet life, always watching over his shoulder and never allowing himself to make close friends, and that he wanted to come back so many times, but he was afraid of bringing danger to our door. As he spoke, tears rolled down his face, and I felt my chest tighten, because part of me understood his fear, and another part of me was screaming that he should have trusted me, and that we could have faced it together. I asked him why now, and he said the people he had been afraid of were gone, and that he had spent years checking and making sure, and that his health was not good, and he did not want to die without seeing his children again, and telling me the truth. I felt like the room was spinning, and I sat down across from him and cried harder than I had in years, and I told him about the nights I stayed up worrying, and the bills I struggled to pay, and the way Luke had grown distant and angry, and the way Emily still kept his old photo in her drawer, and I told him how his absence had shaped every part of our lives. He kept whispering that he was sorry, and that he wished he could take it all back, and that he knew sorry would never be enough. After he left that night, I did not sleep at all, and I stared at the ceiling thinking about everything he had said, and wondering if any of it could make up for the years we lost. And I did not tell the kids right away, because I did not know how. A week later I finally sat Luke and Emily down at the kitchen table, and told them that their father had come back, and Luke stared at me like he did not believe me, and Emily covered her mouth with her hand, and started crying, and Luke stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and he said he did not care, and that Daniel was dead to him. Emily asked where he was, and if he was okay, and I could see the little girl she once was still living inside her heart. Over the next few weeks Daniel started calling and asking if he could see them, and I left that decision up to the kids. And Emily wanted to meet him, and Luke refused and said he did not want anything to do with him. The day Emily met her father again was one of the hardest days of my life, and also one of the most hopeful. And we met at a small diner on Main Street, and Daniel sat across from her nervously twisting his hands, and Emily looked at him with cautious eyes and finally whispered that she had missed him. And he broke down crying and reached across the table to hold her hand, and I watched my little girl comfort the man who had once abandoned her, and my heart ached in ways I did not know were possible. Luke stayed away for months, and Daniel respected his space even though it hurt him deeply, and I could see the regret in his eyes every time he asked about Luke, and I told him that healing would take time, and that some wounds were slow to close. Slowly Daniel started becoming a quiet part of our lives again, and he moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and got a job at a hardware store, and he would come by on Sundays to help fix things around the house, and sometimes we would sit on the porch talking about old memories and new regrets, and there were moments when I felt that old connection and moments when the pain came rushing back just as strong. One evening Luke finally showed up while Daniel was there, and the air felt heavy and silent, and Luke stood in the doorway staring at his father with clenched fists, and Daniel stood up slowly and told Luke he was sorry, and that he did not expect forgiveness, and Luke's voice broke as he asked why he had not been enough for him to stay, and Daniel cried as he told him the truth and apologized again, and Luke stormed out, but that was the first crack in the wall around his heart. Over the next year there were slow, awkward conversations and tense family dinners and moments of anger and tears, but also moments of laughter and understanding, and Daniel proved through his actions that he was trying to make up for lost time, even though he knew he could never fully do so. I did not fall back in love with him the way I once had, but I did learn to forgive him enough to let peace return to my heart, and our family slowly found a new way to exist together, even if it looked different than before. On a quiet summer evening 2 years after Daniel came back, we all sat on the porch watching the sunset, and Luke told a story from his job, and Emily laughed and Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude, and I realized that healing does not mean forgetting, and forgiveness does not mean erasing the past, but it does mean choosing to let go of the weight that keeps you from breathing. The life lesson I carry with me now is that running from fear may feel like protection in the moment, but it leaves scars that last a lifetime, and real love means staying and facing the storm together, even when it feels impossible. The summer air that evening was thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass, and someone down the street was grilling hamburgers and hot dogs, and the sound of laughter floated through the neighborhood, and it felt strange to sit there as a family again, like we were pretending to be something we had once been, but also like we were building something new and fragile at the same time. And Daniel sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap like he was afraid to move too much and break the moment, and I could see in his eyes that he was memorizing every sound and every laugh as if he was afraid it might disappear again. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered that she was glad her dad was back, and my heart squeezed because I could hear both happiness and fear in her voice. And Luke sat on the porch steps staring out at the street and finally spoke and asked Daniel if he remembered the old treehouse they had built in the backyard of our Maple Street house, and Daniel smiled sadly and said he remembered how Luke had insisted on hammering the nails himself and had smashed his thumb, and cried until Daniel gave him a popsicle, and Luke let out a quiet laugh. And that small laugh felt like a door opening just a little. Later that night after Daniel left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, but this time my tears were different, and I realized that part of me was grieving the life we never got to have, while another part of me was cautiously hopeful about the life we might still build in small, quiet pieces. Over the next few months, Daniel kept showing up in steady, simple ways, and he would call every Sunday evening just to ask how our week had been. And he would bring over bags of groceries when he knew money was tight, and he would show up at Luke's community college baseball games and sit in the back of the bleachers, not wanting to make Luke uncomfortable, but wanting to be present. And Luke would pretend not to notice him, but I could tell he did, because his shoulders would relax a little whenever Daniel was there. Emily started inviting Daniel to her small apartment for dinner, and she would cook simple meals like spaghetti and garlic bread, and she would proudly tell him about her job at the daycare, and how the kids there called her Miss Emmy, and Daniel would listen like every word was precious. And sometimes he would bring her little gifts like a new coffee mug or a scarf, and she would hug him tightly before he left. One rainy afternoon, I was folding laundry when Daniel knocked on the door holding an old cardboard box, and he said he had found it in storage and thought I might want it, and inside were old photos and school drawings and birthday cards, and even a faded love note I had once written him, and my hands shook as I held those pieces of our past, and I realized how much time had slipped through our fingers. And we sat at the kitchen table looking through the box and crying and laughing and remembering, and there was a quiet honesty between us that had never existed before. As fall came, the leaves turned bright red and orange, and Luke finally agreed to have dinner with Daniel, and I cooked a simple roast chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans, and the tension at the table was thick at first, and forks scraped against plates in silence, until Luke finally asked Daniel if he had ever thought about us while he was gone, and Daniel said he thought about us every single day, and that some nights he would sit alone in tiny rented rooms staring at the wall, imagining what we might be doing at that exact moment, and Luke's eyes filled with tears even though he tried to hide it. That night Luke stayed after dinner and helped Daniel wash dishes, and they talked quietly in the kitchen, and I stood in the hallway listening and crying softly, because I could hear the walls around Luke's heart slowly crumbling. Winter came with its gray skies and early sunsets, and Daniel slipped on ice outside the hardware store and hurt his knee, and Emily insisted on taking him to doctor appointments, and Luke started checking in on him too, and for the first time since he returned, Daniel was not alone when he was in pain, and I could see in his eyes how deeply that meant to him. On Christmas Eve, we all gathered at my house and decorated the small artificial tree in the living room, and Emily played old holiday songs on her phone, and Luke teased Daniel about his terrible singing voice, and Daniel laughed in a way that sounded lighter than I had ever heard it, and we exchanged simple gifts and ate store-bought cookies, and for the first time in 20 years our family felt whole in a new imperfect way. After everyone left that night, Daniel stayed behind to help me clean up, and as we stood in the kitchen washing dishes, he quietly thanked me for letting him back into our lives, and said he knew he did not deserve it. And I told him that forgiveness was not about what he deserved but about what I needed in order to heal, and we stood there in silence for a moment, and the past and present seemed to gently overlap. Time kept moving forward, and slowly the sharp edges of our pain softened, and even though scars remained, they no longer defined every moment of our days, and we learned how to talk openly about what we had been through and how to support each other when old wounds reopened. One spring afternoon, Luke invited Daniel to help him change the oil in his truck, and they spent the whole afternoon in the driveway talking and laughing. And when Luke came inside, He looked lighter than I had seen him in years, and I realized that forgiveness had finally taken root in his heart. As for me, I learned that love does not always return in the same shape it once had, but it can still grow into something meaningful and steady and kind, and I learned that healing is a quiet daily choice, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open your door again, even when your heart still remembers the pain. And the life lesson that continues to guide me is that time can take so much away, but it can also give back small pieces of hope, and that even after decades of silence, a single knock on the door can change the course of a family forever. The years did not suddenly become perfect after that, and I think that is something people do not talk about enough, because healing is not a straight line, and some mornings I would still wake up with a heavy feeling in my chest, and wonder how different our lives might have been if Daniel had stayed. And some nights Luke would still get quiet and distant when certain memories came up, and Emily would still cry sometimes when she thought about the childhood moments her dad had missed, and Daniel carried his guilt like an invisible weight on his shoulders everywhere he went. But we kept choosing each other in small ordinary ways, and those small choices slowly stitched our family back together in a way that felt real and earned and honest. Daniel started coming over every Saturday morning to drink coffee with me at the kitchen table, and we would talk about simple things like grocery prices and weather forecasts and the strange commercials on late-night TV. And sometimes we would drift into deeper conversations about regrets and fears and hopes, and he would tell me about the lonely years he spent moving from one cheap apartment to another, and how he would sit in laundromats, watching families fold clothes together and feel a pain so deep he could hardly breathe. He told me about the nights he slept in his truck and the holidays he spent alone eating canned soup, and how he kept an old photo of the kids in his wallet, even when it was so worn the faces were barely visible. And I would listen quietly and realize that while we had suffered in different ways, we had all been hurt by the same choices. Emily got engaged to a kind young man named Mark who worked as a delivery driver, and they announced their engagement over dinner one night, and Daniel cried openly and hugged Emily so tightly she laughed, and told him he was crushing her, and Luke teased him about being a softie. And in that moment, I saw how much Daniel cherished the chance to be part of these milestones he had once believed he would never see. When wedding planning began, Emily asked Daniel to walk her down the aisle along with Luke, and when she told him that, his face broke into the most grateful smile I had ever seen, and he whispered that it would be the greatest honor of his life. And I stood there watching them and felt my heart swell with emotions that were both painful and beautiful. As the wedding day approached, Daniel spent weeks nervously practicing his steps and buying a simple but nice suit from a small men's shop downtown, and Luke helped him choose a tie and even joked that he needed to get his act together because he would be in a lot of photos, and Daniel laughed, but I could see the nervous excitement in his eyes. On the day of the wedding, the small-town church was filled with soft music and the smell of flowers, and as Emily walked down the aisle holding both her brother's and her father's arms, I felt tears streaming down my face, and I realized how far we had come from the broken family we once were. And Daniel looked at Emily like she was a miracle, and Luke walked tall and proud beside them. At the reception, Daniel stayed on the edge of the dance floor at first until Emily dragged him out, and they danced awkwardly and laughed, and Luke joined them. And suddenly I was watching my children dance with the man who had once vanished from their lives, and it felt like witnessing a dream I never allowed myself to have. Later that night, Daniel found me sitting alone at a table, and thanked me again for giving him the chance to be their dad again. And I told him that the kids had chosen him, and that he had earned his place back in their lives by showing up day after day, and he nodded with tears in his eyes and said that he would never stop trying to make things right. Life kept moving forward, and Luke graduated from community college and found a steady job, and Emily moved into a small house with Mark, and Daniel was there for every milestone, clapping the loudest and smiling the widest. And sometimes I would catch him quietly wiping tears from his eyes when he thought no one was looking. One evening after a long day, Daniel and I sat on the porch again watching the sun go down, and he admitted that he was scared of losing us again. And I told him that fear was normal, but that the only thing he could do was keep choosing to be present and honest, and that we could only build our future one day at a time. And so we did. We learned to forgive without forgetting, and to love without pretending the past did not happen, and to move forward without running away. And our family became a quiet example in our small town that even broken stories can be rewritten when people are willing to face the truth and stay. The life lesson that lives in my heart now is that disappearance can steal years, but it does not have to steal every tomorrow. and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is come back, and sometimes the bravest thing a family can do is open the door and choose healing instead of hate. The seasons kept turning the way they always do in small towns, and even though time never gives back what it takes, it still leaves space for new memories to grow. And ours began to grow quietly and steadily like wildflowers along an old fence line. Daniel started volunteering at the local community center, fixing broken chairs and helping kids with their bikes, and Luke would sometimes stop by after work and watch him patiently teach a little boy how to tighten a loose chain. And Luke once told me that seeing his dad help other kids helped him heal in ways he did not expect, because it reminded him that people can change when they truly want to. Emily came over most Sunday afternoons with Mark, and sometimes with their first baby wrapped in a soft blanket, and Daniel would hold his grandson with trembling hands and whisper promises he never had the chance to make before. And I would watch him rock that baby gently, and I would see both regret and gratitude in his eyes, and I would silently thank life for giving us a second chance, even if it came late. There were still hard days. Some nights Daniel would call me late, and admit that he was overwhelmed by guilt, and afraid that he would never truly make up for what he had done, and I would remind him that showing up now mattered more than anything he could no longer change, and that healing is not about erasing the past, but about choosing better in the present. Luke would still sometimes struggle with anger and trust, and when he did, Daniel would sit with him quietly and listen without interrupting, and tell him that his feelings were valid, and that he would never run again, and those simple, honest words slowly rebuilt what had once been broken. On the 20th anniversary of the day Daniel disappeared, we gathered at Maple Street in front of the old house that now belonged to another family, and we stood on the sidewalk remembering and crying and forgiving, and Luke placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder and told him that he was glad he came back, and Daniel broke down and hugged his son tightly and whispered that he loved him, and that moment felt like a final knot being untied in our family story. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the familiar hum of my refrigerator, I thought about how fear had once torn our family apart, and how honesty and patience had slowly stitched us back together, and I realized that while our story would always carry scars, it also carried strength. And the life lesson that will forever guide my heart is that people are not defined by their worst mistake unless they choose to stay there, and that love has the quiet power to rebuild what fear once destroyed when we are brave enough to open the door again. A few months after that night on Maple Street, Daniel started getting tired more easily, and he tried to brush it off as getting older, but I could see the change in his face and the way he moved more slowly. And one afternoon Emily called me crying and said her dad had nearly fainted while holding the baby, and my heart dropped into my stomach. And within days he was sitting in a small white doctor's office being told that his heart was not as strong as it should be, and that he would need medication and regular checkups and maybe even surgery someday. Daniel took the news quietly, but later that night he came to my house and sat at the kitchen table staring into his coffee, and whispered that he was afraid, and that he did not want to leave again after he had just found his way back, and I reached across the table and held his hand, and told him he was not alone anymore, and that we would face whatever came together. And I realized how far we had come, because 20 years earlier he had run alone, and now he was choosing to stay. Luke started driving him to appointments, and Emily brought over home-cooked meals, and Mark fixed things around his apartment, and our family moved around him like a quiet circle of care. And Daniel would look at us sometimes like he could not believe we were really there, and he would thank us again and again, and I would remind him that this is what family does. One warm evening Daniel asked us all to come over to his small apartment, and when we arrived he had set up folding chairs in the living room, and he looked nervous and serious. And he told us he wanted to say some things while he had the chance, and he apologized again to each of us, not in rushed guilty words, but in slow thoughtful sentences. And he told Luke how proud he was of the man he had become, and he told Emily how strong and kind she was, and he told me that I had been the heart that kept our family alive when he had failed, and there were tears and hugs and quiet promises, and that night felt like a soft goodbye, even though we did not want to admit it. Months later Daniel did have surgery, and he made it through, but he was weaker afterward, and he moved in with me so we could keep an eye on him. And sometimes I would wake up early in the morning and find him sitting at the kitchen table watching the sunrise through the window, and he would tell me that every extra day felt like a gift he never thought he would receive. He got to see his grandson take his first steps, and he got to attend Luke's wedding, and he got to sit beside me at Thanksgiving and hold my hand while the house filled with laughter and noise and love. and each of those moments felt like a quiet miracle. One calm fall evening, Daniel went to bed early because he said he was tired, and I kissed his forehead and told him good night. And when I checked on him later, he was lying peacefully with a gentle smile on his face, and he had slipped away quietly in his sleep. There was deep grief in our house, but it was mixed with gratitude, and at his small funeral Luke stood up and said that his dad had taught him that it is never too late to come home, and Emily said that forgiveness had given her back a piece of her childhood. And I stood there holding my grandchildren, and realized that even though Daniel had been gone for 20 years, he had spent the rest of his life making it right. The life lesson that stays with me now is that running from your mistakes only multiplies the pain, but facing them with honesty can still plant new joy even in broken ground, and that no matter how long you have been gone, the door to healing can still open if you are brave enough to knock.